Good morning, everyone. My name is Derek Johnson. I'm with Aurora WDC, and we're here today, day two of the Council of Competitive Intelligence Fellows 2020 Summit. It sure is a blessing to be involved in this program, and I hope you all enjoyed the first day yesterday. Today's topic, we are here to talk about intelligence creation in an uncertain world. And boy, isn't it ever an uncertain world that we live in. Before I get to this topic, I'm still blown away by what intelligence legend Liam Fahey shared with us yesterday, and that intersection of using big data to find the small data. And I think that theme you're going to hear about from my three esteemed panelists today. We are absolutely encouraging you to interact with others within the community of practice on the Slack channel. Please do that. The other thing we're encouraging, we have three discussion slides today that Rich, Chris, and Scott will be leading us through and commenting on one another's concepts. And we're encouraging you all to put your Q&A into the Q&A panel as we go so that we can maintain context of those questions throughout rather than saving everything for the end. We'll, of course, have time at the end to do that as well. Myself, I'm not going to read this to you. I continue to be driven in my professional career by the capabilities of our firm and how they translate to the greater good of the professional and personal communities that we serve. My greatest professional honor in my time at Aurora has been to be nominated and inducted into the Council of Competitive Intelligence Fellows in 2015. But I hope that my real legacy is that as being a good and steady husband, a providing and caring father of four kids. And my fun fact is that I've often, especially as I get older, been confused my Hollywood likeness or Hollywood doppelganger as John Malkovich. And I get that on a regular basis. As we go forward to our first panelist, Rich Caldwell. Rich Caldwell is a sector manager strategic landscape assessment for Northrup Grumman information system, where he's been for over 15 years. He has experience that includes corporate level captures, volume lead assignments, and other winning strategies as it relates to contracts in the government intelligence world. A 23-year Air Force veteran. Fun fact about Rich, that we all hope you remember today. Rich flew a Saab Viggen A-37 fighter jet, wait for it, at the age of 16, while on an exchange trip to Sweden in 1976. And Rich, I'll invite you to share a little more about that experience when you can throughout. Moving on to our second panelist, Erickson. Scott is a professor in the marketing School of Business at Ithaca College in Ithaca, New York. He has a book coming out entitled Marketing in a Digital World that's going to be published in 2021. And the fun fact about Scott, he lives on 32 acres with 4 dogs, 6 cats, and 12 chickens. As we go to our third and final panelist for today, Chris Wheaton, who I've gotten to know over the years, and it's been a real blessing to have you in my professional network too, Chris. Professor of Strategic Futures at the U.S. Army War College. Among other things, you manage the Experience the Future lab, which exposes senior Army leaders to cutting-edge commercial technologies. Fun fact about Chris, he lettered in fencing at the University of Notre Dame, and that's a good reminder to me to never challenge you to a duel, Chris. I'll make mental note of that for the rest of all time. As we get started today, again, plug your questions into the Q&A panel, everyone, and let's have a lively and thoughtful, engaging discussion around this topic of intelligence creation in an uncertain world. And as we get to this first slide, this first slide is Scott Erickson's submitted slide. Scott, I'm going to invite you to share with the audience today. We've got about 16 folks besides ourselves out there in the thread as I see it. What kind of big concepts driving them down into key takeaways and insights for our audience today are you trying to get through with this particular slide today?
Well, basically, I'm just going to throw some ideas out there, and we'll kind of go with the the audience and see what's of interest. So I'm not sure there is a theme here other than big data is out there. It's changed how we do things, and I guess just some food for thought from some different areas.
Good.
All right. So yeah, when we were kind of planning this panel, we talked, and I'm a bit of an interloper. I've kind of come in and out of competitive intelligence, but I actually have a research partner I work with, Helen Rothberg, that I think a lot of you know, maybe saw her on a panel yesterday. She's actually the CI half of the team. She's much more active in competitive intelligence than I am. So I have a basic understanding of the field, but I'm more of the internal knowledge guy about what's inside organizations. And to that extent, most of my research is about big data, knowledge, those sorts of things. So I'm going to kind of take the thrust that I should talk about what I know about. So putting this together, I wasn't sure who'd be in the audience. I wasn't sure what you'd already know. So as I said, I'm going to throw a few things out there, and I'm more than happy to go with my other panelists or the group in terms of, okay, what's new to you? What are you interested in? And so on and so forth. So each of these is kind of a different concept. And again, I don't think we'll need to spend real long on any of them, but we can always go into more detail depending on, and again, what the sense of the group is. So as I said, I do research on big data and business analytics. A lot of people don't know that we actually in academia, we do have a definition of big data and what it is. And it's basically the 3 V's, that big data is characterized by increasing volume, all right, which we all know. We generate lots and lots of data and we store it. Data velocity, we get it a lot quicker, so we don't wait for a quarterly report or a monthly report or a weekly report. A lot of data is available instantaneously now. And the third thing is data variety, that we can capture a lot of different types of data. So it's not just straight numbers, but we can capture a lot of unstructured data. So we're talking text, images, video, those sorts of things. And what enables all of this is just that, we've always had a lot of this data, but now it's cost effective to actually store it all. So we can save it and we can analyze it. It's just with cloud computing, especially, storage and processing has gotten so cheap that we have much more available than we used to do. It just makes sense to keep it all and even set up systems to regularly take in all of this data. So with that kind of in mind, if we move to the right, the blue, kind of yellow and red slide is actually from a firm that does trend watching. So very much in the unstructured data category. And what they do is they've got analysts all over the world. I took this down from their site right before the presentation. So they have 1,700 plus professionals across 80 countries. And their job is just basically to look for interesting things. So it's very much unstructured. What do you find that's interesting in your city, in your region, in your country? What's different? And they feed this into a system, and I think they use Slack actually. So it's nothing really necessarily high end of tech. It's a commonly used tool, but they kind of feed it in, and they look and see, okay, what's happening in multiple places? Where can we find trends? Where are people seeing the same kind of things? And as we build up examples, can we kind of make sense of this? And so their job then is to pass that on to their community. And obviously they have clients. They put out a little bit of stuff for free just to whet your appetite, which is what I tend to access and use for my classes. So this Fight for Facts is actually their current news briefing. And specifically what they're talking about is how much people are looking for news nowadays. All right, we're in a pandemic. Suddenly, the search for news has exploded, but at the same time, a lot of it is not necessarily accurate. So it's been called an infodemic by the World Health Organization. You've got authority figures putting out questionable information, and so essentially, what they've spotted is this going on, and that companies are actually starting to respond, that they've spotted this in their environment. And so they are actually taking action to counter it and in some ways actually take advantage of it. So they just list, very quickly, there's an alliance verifying stories from COVID impacted conflict zones. So on the local level, they try and verify whether stories coming out are true. Verification badges for experts like scientists, doctors, and public health is another initiative. A content series providing the truth behind false health information from officials, so kind of spotting false claims and flagging it. Crowdsourcing app to report false information. And again, this is coming from different companies. So they've kind of spotted this change in the environment, and they're able to, again, react to it, and in some cases, take advantage of it in some way. So I think that's just an interesting way to look at the variety of data, while we're also talking about how fast and the volume of it, that there are systems out there to try and process this kind of more unstructured stuff. Move a little bit further to the right on your screen. That's I should probably give a disclaimer. I'm not promoting any companies here, but to the extent that a lot of people use the CRM system from Salesforce, I guess that's something that people would recognize. This is actually not just Salesforce, but this is Salesforce Social Studio. And this is actually a web scraping device. So if you have any experience with social media in your company, you know that there are internal software capabilities like Hootsuite, where you watch your own social media and you see what's happening with it. Social Studio, and there are a lot of competitors of it as well, they're actually web scrapers. So they'll go out there and they'll collect everything on the web. You give it a search term, it will look at social media, it will look at blogs, it will look at reviews, it will look at, again, going through text, going through images, anything that follows that keyword. And what it's able to do then is it monitors volume, and this is in real terms. This is up to the minute, how much volume. So for example, if you put your brand name out there, it would report on how much volume it has right now. It does a sentiment analysis where artificial intelligence sorts it into whether it's positive, negative, or neutral. And that's not a perfect tool, but it's okay to start with. It'll identify where it's coming from. Is it Twitter? Is it reviews? It will tell you if it's coming from someone who's very influential, so someone with a lot of followers who might, if they say something good or something bad, might have more impact than someone generically talking about your brand. And it actually allows click-through. So if you want to see what is actually being said, all right, not just how it's classified by the sorting system, but what's actually being said. So this is a really influential person. They're talking about us. It's negative. What are they actually saying out there? And you can click through and look at that as well. And it's a nice tool, again, and you can keep track on your own brands, on competitor brands, on other topics, pretty much just about anything you want to. And it's really very handy for that. Going down to the left-hand corner, which incorporates some of this, one new thing on the horizon that I actually just found out, I guess in the last year, is intent analysis. And this is really interesting to me because it's used in business-to-business sales, basically, and there are several providers. And what it does is it tries to identify potential purchasing signals. So, if you've got your Salesforce out there and you've got your own website, you have some of this, all right? If someone comes to your website and they they look for content on buying X system. You've got someone who's probably in the early stages of considering purchasing that system. And you can capture that data and alert your salespeople and get them out there and then so on and so forth. This goes much wider than that. So it actually tries to flag that intent before they even come within range of your company. I mean, obviously you can do it on a company level as well. So the visual there is just actually looking at what people tend to do when they're initially researching some sort of information. And again, in this context, it's on a particular product or a particular purchase they might make or something like that. And so the gray ones on the right are internal. All right, so you're asking your internal people, you're tracking your internal stuff, you're talking to some of your partners and getting that. But you can see that over half is actually from external. So if I'm looking at a complex computer system, maybe I go to one of the big tech consultancies and see what they have to say about the offerings in that area. Maybe I go and look on a news site. Maybe I go see to a publisher and see if they have any reviews on that sort of thing. So it actually brings external information searching in, even paid search. You know, if someone has done a Google search, someone can capture that by paying for search for AdWords and you know, the paying for the search results to come up in the search results. So there's all sorts of ways to do this. And again, these companies have leveraged that. Okay, so they're actually providers of this, so you don't have to set it up yourself. So, you know, specifically third-party intent, they say it comes from content. So people searching for content, again, on possibly news sites, consultants, from search, okay, depending on what search terms they're looking at, from clicking on ads, all right, so again, AdWords and things feeds that in, from internet scraping, such as the Social Studio we just looked at, and from publishers. And so again, I just downloaded this as an example. One of the competitors there, they have a connection to 3,800 websites that are part of a proprietary B2B data co-op, monitors 3 million domains, 28 billion monthly consumption events. So again, if someone goes to a tech publisher, does a search on this particular you know, big purchase item, they'll alert you to that. So they actually get information from CNET and you know, from Gartner and, you know, companies that people would normally search if they're looking for this sort of thing. And it's again, if you want to be tipped off early as far as customers thinking about certain types of purchases, you know, it's kind of invaluable to have this sort of information. And again, it's real time. You know, it's a ton of data, huge variety of sources, huge variety of data, and again, it's literally in real time. All right. And that brings us to the last piece, which I can get through kind of quickly. It's just to that last visual on the right is really just say, okay, we've got all this big data. So the machines are bringing all this in and there's some artificial intelligence to it, but you still need the human element. You know, even the intent, you got to think about what your search words are. You know, what do you want to monitor? Someone's got to think about that. And someone's got to make sense of then the information coming in and what to do about it. So managing all this data, you know, it's a treasure trove, but you still need someone with the intelligence to put it together properly. You know, there is that role for the individual. And in fact, I would say that's probably the most important role, because if you can't figure out how to use these systems to best effect, there's kind of no point to them. So it's the idea that the machines and the humans work together to make this all effective. All right. And again, I'm not sure what that all adds up to, what the theme is, but I'll throw it all out there. And again, happy to go deeper in anything anyone's interested in, or, you know, we move on and see what the other panelists have to say. So thank you.
Thank you, Scott. So you said the three V's: volume, velocity, and variety. And
Yep.
the takeaway that I have from this is you can have all that data, but without the human brain, human mind being there to make sense of it all. The kind of the interpretation, the sense making elements of it are obviously vital. Chris Wheaton, when you see this slide and its various contents, what comes to your mind?
Hey, thanks, Derek, and Scott. Thanks. That was interesting. I wound up taking a whole bunch of notes for me to follow up on later. So thanks for the work, man.
Sure. Yeah,
appreciate it.
Anytime.
But no, seriously, there are a couple of things that sort of resonated with some themes that I had been exploring over the last year since I've been at the War College. So one of the first things I did when I got to the War College was send out a note to sort of all the people that would talk to me, anybody I could find, and say, what do you think are the most overhyped technologies, and what do you think are the least hyped technologies today? So what are we paying way too much attention to, and what are we paying too little attention to? And I got to be honest with you that the one that popped up fairly consistently across all the people that responded to me was this one. This idea of big data and artificial intelligence. And it wasn't that, and let me be very careful about what I'm trying to say, because I'm not trying to undermine anything Scott says. Again, as I said, I found it all very, very interesting. But the idea is that among all the people, it wasn't, is that it was, I'm sorry, I just saw a note pop up on my screen and it distracted me for a second. It wasn't that it wasn't going to be important, right? Everybody acknowledged, yeah, I mean, all this data, we're going to figure out how to parse it, and artificial intelligence is going to be critical to that because there's just too much of it for humans to do. And everybody sort of made the same points that humans are going to have to be in the loop. But the general consensus was people are expecting too much out of it sort of too soon. It's not, in many respects, ready for prime time. And I think there's some technical reasons for that. And I'm not a technical superstar. I don't want to speak to those. There are also a lot of ethical issues that are starting to emerge in terms of problems with these sorts of approaches to big data. And then, as a guy who started out his career in building expert systems, right? So I was kind of a victim of the first what people call AI winter, where AI was supposed to change the world, and then all of a sudden it fell off a cliff. And then there's been another one since then. So we've actually had two sort of AI winners where AI was supposed to change the world, and then it sort of fell off the cliff. I'm a little skeptical about sort of, by nature, having gotten burned on one and having sort of watched from afar the second one, whether this ramp up, either due to technical or ethical or social or whatever kind of reasons, is going to be able to deliver on some of the promises, which are, in my sense, are kind of hyperbolic in some cases, about what AI and big data are going to be able to do for us. And I kind of would like to give Scott, because he knows a lot more about this than I do, obviously. I just kind of want to hear a little bit about his response to that. And I'm sure he's familiar with all of those issues. I kind of just want to hear what he has to say in response to that.
Yeah, I think you're 100% right with the expectations are out of line for what it can do. In fact, I think intelligence is probably a misnomer. That's not what it does well, at least in the way that we think about intelligence. One thing I didn't talk about when you look at big data, I think there's two ways that you use it. One is you set up a dashboard and you just watch it go by, you monitor it. And another is where you actually do the deep dive into the predictive analytics and you really try and understand the correlations and try and use that to figure out, what's going to happen in the future. AI can be very effective in the first instance. You're just watching the data go by, you have some hiccup, and AI can help respond to that. In fact, it can learn what the correct response is to that. And yeah, you probably want to bring in someone to make sure it's doing the right response until it learns whether it's correct or not. But it's pretty good at just watching the data go by and reacting to it. AI's good at that because it's really based on repetition and learning what works. The second part where you've got a collection of data and you're really trying to make sense of it and draw insight from it, that's not what AI is supposed to do. It's just, again, that's where you need something totally different. And that's where you need the human intelligence analyst to really make sense of it. And that's why I say, I don't think intelligence is a good word for AI. I don't think that isn't really what it does. And if it's sold that way, yeah, that's why I think there's disappointment with it.
Rich Caldwell, what comes to your mind when you see this and all of its contents?
Well, two things jumped in my mind, and I'll address both. The first was data assurance, and the second was data ethics, using massive amounts of data. In my industry, when we say the word web scrape, our lawyers get real nervous about that. If you ever have a chance, go look at some of your competitors or websites, go down to the bottom where it says terms of use and read those. Our lawyers read those. So when you're talking about web scraping, 15 competitors maybe, they all have different terms of use. Some of them say specifically you can't web scrape. You're not allowed to do that. Most of them say everything on these pages are copyrighted. So if you want to use our logo, you've got to ask our permission. And on and on and on. So you start reading that type of thing. And so there's an ethical consideration about web scraping, and then the sources that may come in off of those. Generally, in the internet, if we're staying with just the basic, World Wide Web, and we're staying off the dark web, right, we're probably okay. You're not hitting WikiLeaks and places that, download illegal information, right? We can't use that. So the ethics comes into this. How do you use that? And this kind of dovetails on my first thing that popped in my head is data assurance. There was a book put out 3 or 4 years ago. I haven't read it for a while. It was by Kathy O'Neill called Weapons of Math Destruction. And she addresses the big data issues. And there's several discussions in there about how big data used incorrectly, gives you wrong results. And she goes through this explanation of why colleges cost so much. And they don't cost so much because of the operating expenses. They cost so much just because they cost a lot. People think if I pay a lot of money, I'm going to get a better education. Mm-hmm. And that's what the data showed them. And nobody really put the thought behind it. So that's the human aspect. Nobody put the analysis behind that and say, wait a minute, that's a faulty assumption to make, that you get a good education if you pay more money. But that's what it is. And then really what happens with this big data stuff is the social structure. The people at the lower income, the disadvantaged folks, they're hurt most by these data structures, by the census, by all these things out there because of data assurance. And so when I was looking at this 3 or 4 years ago, I noticed that at least in the DoD, some of the branches of service brought on data scientists, chief data officers, so they could address these issues, so they could make sure that you weren't using faulty information. And then they were addressing also the ethics. How do we apply that? I mean, I think this is a fantastic area to tap into in our area, but in our field of competitive intelligence, but we have to be careful, making sure we have good data sources and making sure we're using it ethically. So those are the things that kind of popped into my mind. Yeah. So how do you apply those? I don't know where the field's going with that, Scott.
I couldn't agree more. I mean, I think that to the extent that you're seeing more regulation come into the field, there have been some bad actors, absolutely. And when an industry proves it can't police itself, there will be action taken, and I think we're seeing that. And I think that just reinforces that there needs to be some human judgment involved in all this, that you can't just set up the system and let it run. It really, you need someone to make sure it's collecting data from where it's allowed to take data from, and you need someone to, make sure it's accurate. And again, the system can't really police itself. So I think, again, the whole idea that it's a tool, but the human element, I think, in a lot of ways is much more important to make sure it works right.
Well, it's really, stemmed a whole new career field of data scientists.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
I mean, I would love to have one on our staff. I've been asking for one for a long time, so we can figure this all out. But how is that? How is that playing out now? I don't know if you teach in one of the college. You mentioned Helen. I've talked to her
Yeah.
about this.
Uh, well, we and practically every college and university we know of now has a data analytics program of some sort. It's in demand. It's a useful skill. What's growing these days, students want to be trained in some sort of analytics, and that could be as a data scientist. It could be as someone who kind of sets up the computer systems, or it could be the person who makes sense of it all. All right, and that's something, my students tend to be marketing students, and I tell them, you got to be able to talk to the data scientists. You don't have to do their work, but you really need to know enough to have an intelligent conversation with them. So I think it's being seen in huge demand for analytic skills of some sort.
Thank you, gentlemen. I'm going to keep us moving in the interest of time, but before we go to the next slide, we actually do have a poll for our audience. So I'd like to invite the poll to be shown. Which disruptive element over the past 6 months has been the most difficult to deal with in your competitive intelligence efforts? We're going to leave this up for 1 minute. And I don't know, guys, what do you think is going to be the most popular choice or choices amongst our audience today?
Well, it's like we're getting hit with everything here, from murder hornets to pandemics to economic issues. So it's going to be interesting to see. I think it's going to be varied by industry. I don't know. That's my guess.
I'm going to bet on social. I think all of these come back to a social situation that is very much in flux, and that manifests itself throughout the rest of them. In even technology, it manifests itself, I think, so if I had to pick a core issue, core disruption to the element, it would be social.
Real quick, Scott, what do you think?
I'm trying to figure out where I would put pandemic in all that, and I'm not exactly sure where it fits.
All of them.
Yeah.
We all.
Yeah, I mean, probably its impact on the economy to me would be the biggest disruptor.
Why don't we bring up the results? Let's take a look. Social at 53%, economic 27%, geopolitical 13%. Okay. Sort of aligned with what you gentlemen predicted. All right, let's take the poll down and move to the next slide. Rich Caldwell, this next slide is your slide. And I know that you have a very interesting acronym that you plan to share with our group today.
So, in my industry, with all this uncertainty, it comes into terms of what I call disruption. It's been disruptive for us. And there was a time in our industry where everything was pretty predictable. We had predictable funding cycles. We had predictable acquisition cycles. And you just stayed out ahead of the game, and you knew what was going to happen the next year and next year and next year. Before all this stuff that started at this year, our industry started changing. The DoD industry figured out that they were falling behind technologically. And so they started changing their acquisition systems, which became a disruptive element in itself. And we found that, they had a tendency, our customers had a tendency now to start looking at commercial off-the-shelf capabilities, and they're shying away from the big aerospace and defense firms. So that was the first part of disruption that we started to see. And then after that, things started happening rapid succession. Things, geopolitically around the world. We saw near peers become much more capable in what they're able to do. We saw companies like SpaceX get into our business. So we see a lot of things happening. Amazon, Google, places we never thought of before that would be competitors that we're now having to track and monitor on a daily basis. And so we entered into this new phase now, and then all of a sudden we have a pandemic, we have a lot of social and geopolitical things going on. And internally we thought, does it make sense to keep running our intelligence cycle the way we're running it? Does it make sense to do that? And so the answer that we came up with is, the analysis doesn't change. The analytical frameworks that we're using, they're solid, they work. What we're finding out is this is where you find out the most about your competitors. When they're under stress, that's where you see their culture. That's where you see their strengths and weaknesses and how they're operating. We've seen companies disappear off the map that were competitors before. We see acquisitions going on. We see how they're dealing with things, and you really get to see their culture. So these times for a CI person are very exciting to us because it's peeling back the onion a little bit and peeling back the layers on our competitors, and not only that, on our customers. And it's really telling you what type of company or what type of customer they are. They're under stress. They're all trying to deal with the same things we are. And so this is where you start to see how they're structured, where their chief revenue streams are coming from, what's important to them, what franchises are they going after, and how they will compete. It's not just necessarily, how they're built, but how will they compete? And we've all had to take an inward reflection, look at that and say, what kind of company are we? Are we going to take care of our people? Are we going to go after these opportunities? And so there's a lot of questioning going on within our industry about how we operate, and we're gonna emerge from all this different companies. But for a CI analyst, the tools are the same. The thing that has changed is we've got to move faster. One of the things that our customers implemented and have kind of nudged our industry to implement was agile processes, right? And so that's the buzzword of the year, I think, is agile DevOps. It's a important process that we see that if you implement it and use it for software and for building it, you can really march through the cycles quicker. And that's how we're keeping up with the acquisition cycle changing on us. Well, now they're trying to change that and say, let's use that for all processes. Let's go entirely agile. And this is where I think we need to take in, a real good look at this. Trying to do intelligence in an agile process just doesn't make sense to me. So that's been a disruption that we're trying to deal with. I'm trying to explain to our coaches, I can't really sprint intelligence. Intelligence takes time. There's art to it. It's not science and there's art. And sometimes I can get you the answer, and sometimes it's going to take weeks, and I think they're beginning to see that. So that's been some disruption that we're having to deal with. Another one that we've had to deal with is primary intelligence. A big thing that we like to do is go to trade shows. I mean, I go to many trade shows internationally, domestically, and that's where I get a lot of primary intelligence. And we feel that we have a pretty good intelligence capability of doing that. And we also have a counterintelligence function that we set up at trade shows and run as well. Well, that's been pulled away from us. We can't meet in person. The last one I went to was in February. We were told not to shake hands. We had to bump a lot of elbows. And then after that, they shut it down. No more. And we probably won't see any more trade shows until sometime next summer. So what we've been having is these virtual trade shows. And in fact, I was on one here the last 2 days. I'm on another one next week. And we're trying to figure out, how do you do primary intelligence in this new environment? And we're struggling with it. So one of the things that, here's that acronym that we fell back to. One of the things that I first started doing is using a system called POTS, plain old telephone system. That's where you pick up a phone and you call somebody. And it's amazing the amount of intelligence you can get by calling and talking to folks. Staying away from the secondary stuff. Call a supplier up. Call up a sub. You can even call your competitors if you're careful on how you do that. And so I got in the habit of developing relationships at trade shows with folks, and where I could call them up. They knew what I was doing, but I could call them up and say, I'd like to have my boss talk to your boss. Who would that be? They need to talk some business stuff, and And in that conversation, I'd go back and look at my notes that I wrote about them. Say, oh, I see you're from California. How are the kids doing? You said they're in baseball, and you start, doing that, and it's amazing how those skills start coming back to you. So we've been using that quite a bit. So primary intelligence, it's been difficult. And then how do you deliver high quality intelligence, in an unstable environment? I think we're able to do that. We're able still to do that. There's some tools missing from us. You can still go through the intelligence cycle. You can still apply the frameworks. You can still do the things you did in the past, but it's coming at you so quick now. During disruptive environments, things really happen. And like I said, the onions pull back a little bit. You start seeing insights that you haven't seen before, and you start coming up with information. So, this is an exciting time for us, but it's very, very disruptive. So one of the tools, of course, we use is STEEP, right? STEEP analysis, or PESTLE. What better time to run those analysis than now, to look at the technological, social. So, that's why we threw the poll up. Social, that's a huge element right now. I was on a discussion early this morning about the social and environmental impacts that our HR, for instance, when they go out and hire folks, they're asking us questions now. These young engineers. So what's your zero emissions policy? Our zero emissions policy. They're interested in things like that. They want to come to a company that's socially responsible and economically responsible. So just 2 weeks ago, we made an announcement that all of our Virginia facilities are going to go fully electric by 2025. I saw that and I said, well, okay, that's kind of neat, but it created such a lot of conversations on LinkedIn and social networks. I thought, oh my gosh, this is really important to people. And so I think companies have to look at that internally. And so when I look at my competitors, we look at their scorecard now. We don't just look at what's their revenue, let's run a 5 forces, let's do this and this and this. We look at their social responsibility, their hiring practices, their diversity. When we pull up an org chart now, that's one of the things that really stands out to me. I look at their diversity and go, wait a minute. This looks like a bunch of retired military people that I worked with. This company may not have that culture to deal with what's happening today. So those are the things that are kind of on the top of my head. So I'll turn it back over to you, Derek. And
thanks, Rich. And I'm going to go to Scott next. But before I go to you, Scott, Eric Lippman had a good question. Rich, have you been attending the current round of virtual trade shows? And so that's just an insight that he's found them to be quite informative and good opportunities for primary CI collection. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, so I was just on one here. Actually, it's still going on today. The Air Force Association has a virtual trade show going on, and everybody's dealing with it differently. Some companies have, just a site up and you go to the web page, and okay, I can already do that. That's secondary intelligence. One of our competitors, I won't say who it was, I went into there, I hit their go here button, and immediately I was put into a Zoom session with all their salesmen. I thought, oh, I wasn't prepared for that because typically when I go to a trade show, I walk in and do elicitation techniques, and I talk about the weather and this, and I follow John Nolan's hourglass, and do some other things like that. Now I'm sitting there and I have VPs, program managers, engineers staring at me, and they want to do business with me. They're saying, hey, gee, we understand that you're in this business, and all of a sudden, like, oh, talking to the wrong person, right? So that was a shock, but we're not getting the fidelity and the type of primary intelligence we have in the past. What I am doing is collecting contacts, collecting information, and using the side channels, using the chats, talking to people, saying, hey, how you like this new format? What's going on? And here's my phone number. Let's talk sometime. Maybe we can chat about the industry. So it gives me a chance to open up the door to use POTS, right? Plain old telephone system for later, but you got to be creative, right?
Right on. I love the POTS. I'm going to, we all, as kids, or my kids are doing the game of telephone. Yeah, obviously that's a different thing, but I love that acronym. Scott, I'm going to go to you next and then to Chris, but I want you to keep in mind a question submitted by Cliff Caldwell. And the question is, does the sponsor of the big data tool matter in terms of credibility, data assurance, and ethics? This is a bit related to Scott's prior slide. And for example, if IBM Watson is the source, can it be trusted? Scott, what say you about Rich's material, and then that question from
yeah, I thought Rich's stuff is great. As I said, the human element is probably the most important here. I'm curious. You said it's hard to be agile and hard to speed it up. Is there a way to do that? I mean, if you have a directive that says, "Yeah, we need you to speed it up," period. We don't want to hear any excuses. Can the secondary sources maybe help focus your primary data gathering? I mean, if you really have to, can you be more agile if that's kind of the directive that you're giving?
Yeah, we have some basic frameworks that we all use, and I've come down to a handful of ones that work well for us, and I'm training my folks. And hey, if we're going to do something, you got to focus. You really have to focus and use these things here. There's a lot of cool stuff out there you come across, but you got to focus and get what I call the staples. So gather the staples. An example would be if you ever use like the business canvas, right? That kind of focuses you into certain areas that you'd want to look at. What are their key resources, partners, and things like that. It's a focus tool. It allows you to go and collect the things that you need. Can we do it faster? Can we be more agile? Oh, there was a saying when I was in special ops that you can't produce special ops overnight, right? And I have my own rules of special ops codes that I've translated into CI codes, and one of them is you can't develop quality intelligence overnight. It takes time. It takes some effort. But there are some baseline fundamentals that you can get through. Is that intelligence? I don't think so. I think the intelligence comes from the primary human that you get out there, and you marry up and say, why did my competitor take a $250 million loss in this area? That's reported. I can say what that is, but to find out why they did that takes time. So hopefully that answers your question.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks. And Derek, did you want me to go back to Cliff's question, or?
Sure. And I see that you addressed it in the Q&A page.
Yeah, I mentioned it, but just for everyone, something like Watson. I mean, Watson's impeccable, but it's basically so is SAS, and so is people who use SPSS or R. It depends on what the tool is, but certainly if it's a brand name, it probably got the brand recognition for a reason. And something like Watson is great at the data processing and the statistical analysis. I'd probably trust a go-to commercial provider that actually tries to make sense of the analysis. I trust them more for that sort of thing. If I just want my data crunched, yeah, Watson and those type of things are absolutely great. It depends on what they have the reputation for. I think that's it. Yes, you can trust them, but what's the reputation for?
Good. Chris Wheaton, let's go to you on Rich's slide and any other comments you might have about Cliff's question as well.
Well, let me address the data reliability sort of question, because it's an area I've done some research in, and I've had some of my former students do the research in. I think they came up with a pretty good model for that. And I think one of the key things to answer that kind of question is to, first of all, have a notion of what it is that counts as reliable data to you. So that you have a model of what that is in your head, and to a certain extent, you if not quantify, it's too strong a word, but at least have a checklist, right? So that when something new comes in, you can sort of go through and say, hey, this punches tickets. And a lot of people haven't sat down and actually thought about that. One of the best products I've ever seen was a former student of mine and well known to at least some of you in the CI community, Neemal Paul. And Neemal did a study. He was in exactly this kind of situation. In India, he had been a plain old telephone system kind of CI collector. And what he had noticed is that no one that he had worked for had ever given him sort of a rubric of being able to tell whether the guy at the other end of the line was or should be reliable, right? So he did his thesis for me, and he wrote a fairly good thesis, or a really good thesis, don't get me wrong. If anyone's on the line, I apologize. It was a really good thesis. And what he did, though, is he compared sort of how does law enforcement, how does business, to the extent that there is literature in the business community, and how does national security, and there's actually more literature than you would expect. How do they assess sort of primary source reliability? He sort of cross-referenced all three of those, all of the sources he could find, and sort of built a matrix. Says, here's how you do it. And so one of the big things at the top of his list was, have they been reliable before? Do I have a history of reliability with this particular source? So on the Watson question, right, if I've used Watson in other ways, and Watson's been consistently reliable, that's a good indicator, right? It's not the only indicator, but it's a good indicator. The other one is, another one that pops up in his list, for example, is can I corroborate the information I'm getting from this source with another reliable source? So in other words, an independent, obviously, reliable source. Do I have two sources basically saying the same thing? And then he kind of walks you through the list. And what that list does is it separates the psychology from it. Because oftentimes, the other thing that he found is that when you are listening to people and you're talking to people, the research, the psychological research on our ability to sort of detect liars and detect when people are lying is actually pretty bad. And again, trained people have a better capability than untrained people. Don't get me wrong, training does matter, but it's still not particularly good. You can be fooled, right? You can be fooled by someone who's confident. You can be fooled by someone who is, who comes across as being better than they are. We're just sort of hardwired to fall into that. And so, sort of what the research that I've seen and to a certain extent participated in, at least as thesis advisor, and I've had other students who looked at the same question, is that's the kind of thing that having that list before you sort of make your decision about whether the source is reliable or not, sort of deciding what's important to you, right? I think is a big step forward for assessing, credibility and reliability, frankly, of any source, whether it's an online data source or a primary source. But anyway, I'll offer that for what that's worth. In terms of what we were talking about earlier, in terms of what Rich was talking about earlier, I did have one real quick question for him, because you're right. I mean, it's going to be a year, right, before we're all able to go back to trade shows or conferences or anything, or probably a year anyway, before they start to ramp up and pick back up again. And that sort of implies that open source research skills, that secondary source, those skills might be the most important thing to be giving people right now in terms of, I can't do some of these other things, so I want you to do more of this. Where are you, and sort of where is anybody who wants to comment this, where are you finding bang for your buck in terms of secondary source research skills? In other words, what are you training your people on now, such that you can sort of extract better, more, whatever data from the insights, right, from secondary sources?
Yeah. So what I try to do, and I've been working on this for quite a while, for at least a decade, is trying to get a consistency and high reliability of checking secondary sources. In some cases, we subscribe to primary or into premium services that provide you things. But there's plenty of data out there, secondary data that you can pull down. If you want to look at acquisition data, you can go to the Federal Procurement Database, and you can go at it. You can go back years and years and years and pull up trends. One of the things that I teach my folks to do is read financial reports. It's not fun. It's like reading a telephone book, but occasionally there's some nuggets in there. And usually companies like to hide them. I teach them where to hide. Bad news is always hidden. It's always in the back, right? We listen to earnings analysis. I says, listen to the earnings analysis, not necessarily what they're trying to tell you, that's marketing, but the questions the analyst asks. Those questions are the best. And if you can make a relationship with one of those analysts, you can feed them questions. I'm interested to see what happened to the $75 million they had over here. And occasionally they'll ask those questions. Some other sources, probably non-traditional. I mean, we can go out there and get the news feeds and stuff like that. I have a lot of tools that aggregate that stuff. That's high level stuff. That's staples. But occasionally, and here's the problem. I'd go to trade shows. I would make friends with the reporters, the defense news reporters, the ones that were credible, right? To the point, I would start, using Twitter or something like that, and just, hey, well, congratulations on the new sun, or congratulations on this. Hey, I really liked your report on that. And then after a while, you have this relationship built up with them, and there's what I call mafias. There's defense analysts out there. These people do this as a hobby that are really good at getting information. I don't know how they do it. Some of them don't identify who they are. So you start tapping into those type of things to get that deeper level. But basically, I'll take a framework and I'll teach them how to do that. So you got to do this first, get the levels, and then when it doesn't add up, when it doesn't make sense, that's when we start digging into things. So we show them tool sets and things like that. And it says, and that's where your skills come in. That's where the art comes in. When you look at this and say, well, how did they do that? What happened here? Those are the questions that you'll start seeing after a while, and you develop an eye for. But a disciplined process. I usually give them about 5 or 6 different analytical techniques. I built some workbooks for them and say, this is what I want you to do. Then when we get to this point here, we get into a group, we do some analysis. I hopefully if I designed it to take the bias out. That was my biggest concern. I want to take the bias out. I don't want you to walk in here and say, I'm going to find out what's wrong with this company. I want you to go in there and say, find out all the data and the leading indicators. And I call it building a body of knowledge. You build this body of knowledge, then you go out there and you have to prove or disprove something, your assumptions, right? And that really pays off, because when you're standing from an executive and you're telling them, this is what I think they're going to do, and they're saying, I don't believe you. You can pull up your body of knowledge, says, let me show you. And you got an audit trail. Right? So hopefully that answers your question.
I like that. Take the bias out, build the body of knowledge, move the process along. Beto has a good question. If you gentlemen have any comment on it. What about the balance between focus and big picture? Today, I'm seeing more fragmentation than ever and lack of systemic thinking. You want to take that one?
Well, so that goes back to what I've been trying to strive for. I think I'm with you on that, Beto. I've been trying to get people into systematic thinking. I have them when I get a new analyst on board. I refer them to a certain set of books. Critical thinking. I pull up the bias code. Have you ever seen that? It's this huge map that shows you all the different types of biases. We walk through there. We talk about how to take that out. And I said, what you have to do is focus on getting the information. You have to go out and get that type of stuff. And we actually follow a systematic approach. We've taken some courses on that from the ACI folks. We had them come in and teach us about systematic, intelligence gathering and using those tools. And so I try to focus on that first as your baseline, your fundamental, right? And it's true. I mean, we get folks that come in and they're all over the place. They're hitting the web, and they're pulling in, they're web scraping. They're coming in and saying, look at all the stuff I found. And I go, what does that mean? A lot of that's marketing. Do you realize there's a company called PRN News that you pay them for an article and they publish it as if it's a real news report, but you wrote it? I says, you got to stay away from those sources. Go get the information yourself. Go to the source. So, that's how I fight it.
Chris or Scott, any comment on that question? And while you're thinking about it, I'll bring up another good question for Yvonne Davis. My focus is in CIs on legal, trying to interact with the quote unquote kid on the block virtual law firms. Any suggestions for her?
Just commenting on the previous one, I think a company that sets up a big data system to constantly bring in certain amounts of data, I think you need to think big picture before you do that, so that what you're bringing in makes sense, and when you put it all together, then you're actually able to have the big picture. And I kind of like Rich's point about telling his new analyst, to learn about that company, everything about that company, and as opposed to worrying about the little details, become an expert in this, you know, whatever that is, the bigger picture, and the little details, I think, help you do that. So, yeah, I think if that's not being done, it's a problem.
I know I see you, Rich, you want to address this, but
So, when when you're talking about the virtual law firms, are you talking like the LegalZoom.com and all those type of organizations? Maybe I'm misreading you on this. Virtual law firms. I mean, I suppose there's a lot of them out there now popping up, and it's hard to collect intelligence on how they do that. I was just trying to clarify what you were asking.
I'm sensing that Yvonne might be talking about doing a primary collection or primary CI in a era also that is so virtual in our world that a certain world that we live in.
Oh yeah. Yeah, so I mean, there's a lot of social tools out there. There's a lot of blogs. There's a lot of things that happen, online out there. So when we teach primary intelligence collection, we don't just talk about trade shows. I list about 25 areas that you can go out there and look at for primary intelligence, including transcripts. When one of your customers goes up and testifies at conferences, at Congress, that's primary intelligence. That's right. It's just written out for you, right? So, I mean, there's some areas that you can look at. Let me see. Firms that have little or no presence. Oh, yeah. So, we have problems with firms that have no presence, and usually they're not public firms, right? Going out there and finding information on firms that seem to not have a virtual presence or anything like that. But you know what? They leave ripples because companies have to market. Companies have to tell their customers a little bit about themselves. They don't just go into business and say, hey, let's let them try to figure out, what we're selling them. They leave, exhaust. And I think it was Leonard Full that came up with that. They have a digital exhaust that's out there that you can go track, how they marketing, who they selling to, and things like that. So it's harder. You have to put that information together, but it is available. It takes a little bit of work.
So we have just under 1/3 of our 90 minutes left for our final slide. Chris Wheaton, you're on deck. What I find so intriguing about this, and you wouldn't give it away ahead of time in our prep for today, but emphasis versus time. I can only imagine it's a lot more complex, this slide that it explains than it might look. Take it away.
All right, well, thank you very much, and I appreciate the time. So what I'm going to do today is the whole theme of this hour and a half has been about managing uncertainty, and what I hope to do today is to give you a suggestion on how to do that. All right, so the last two speakers have talked about how do we speed it up, and I have an answer, maybe not the answer, but I have an answer to that, and it is in this slide. And I'll get to that in just a second. Let me just sort of give you the suggestion first, and then let me walk you through sort of this slide and some of the evidence I have to support the suggestion. The suggestion is to take a look at your processes. If you haven't defined them, define them. And then think to yourself, am I defining this process in a sequential manner? In other words, am I saying do step A, then do step B, then do step C? If you think about the intelligence cycle, which has been referenced a couple of times, it is a sequential process, right? But this can actually apply. My suggestion is more broadly. It's not just the intelligence cycle. It's any process that when you sit back and think about it, we're doing it sequentially. And then try to do a little thought experiment where you reinvent that process as a parallel process, where all the things that you said, step A happens and then step B happens, reimagine it as if step A and step B are happening at the same time. That's a parallel process, right? I think if you look at a lot of the things that we do, we talk about them sequentially, and we certainly teach them sequentially, because you kind of have to teach things sequentially. You can't teach everything at once. You have to teach it in order. And so people get into their heads that sequential processes are the way that's the right way to do processes. But computer programmers and the agile process that was mentioned earlier, those are actually part of what's different about them, is that at least part of that is we're trying to think in a more parallel way, where we're trying to see multiple functions happening at the same time. Now, this is going to be an interesting thought experiment, because even if it turns out to sort of, that didn't really work for me, it's still going to be an interesting thought experiment. And let me use the example on the screen to show you why. So 15, almost 20 years ago now, I started using this as a way to explain the intelligence process to students, because it made more sense to me than the intelligence cycle. And I think particularly as the world gets faster, as the world gets more uncertain, this only makes more sense to me. This is kind of a better picture about the way that things are done, as opposed to sort of a more traditional sequential and circular process. And the key here is that it's a parallel process. So let me start on the left-hand side. What's not on the screen is sort of an establishment of the requirement, or establishment of the need to get some intelligence, an answer for something. And that's a nebulous time. Sometimes it's set in stone. Somebody hands you a document and says, here, go find this out, or give me some insight into this particular question. But oftentimes it's much more nebulous than that. So the start line, it's a nice firm line, but it's kind of fuzzy. It should be fuzzy in your mind. What you're looking at over time, and the finish is when you deliver that answer. It can be an interim answer, it can be the final answer, it's an answer, right? At some point, the whole process can be curtailed because I don't have 6 weeks, I got 3 weeks to answer the question. But at some point, you deliver something to the decision maker, and that is sort of where the finish line. Again, kind of fuzzy, keep that kind of fuzzy in your head. And of course, time happens, right? So time gets expended. And what I saw is that there were 4 sort of what I would call essential functions of intelligence, and that what really changed was how much emphasis you were putting on that function over time. Now, this is a notional graph, right? So don't take it, the lines that I've drawn on there are obviously notional. They're not hardcore, they're not data driven, they're notional to help explain the concept. But the first line, where there's the most emphasis, right? And if you have to sort of backtrack it from modeling, it's the lowest thing on the right-hand side, but it's the first thing that happens on the left-hand side. So the place where emphasis you get this sort of emphasis the most, earliest, is in what I call modeling. And modeling is actually composed of 2 things. So the first thing it's composed of is sort of how we think about this question. And a good example of this is, so you ask the same question of an economist and a military person, right? Their models of what is important in terms of answering that question are going to be very different, right? The economist is going to have all this economic knowledge in their head, and you're going to see, you can almost see if you mapped it as a mind map, which is what I often do. You mapped it as a mind map, you could imagine this great big sort of branch off to the left on economics, and then maybe a couple of other branches that are not as fully developed because that's not their area of expertise. While the same exact question presented to a military person or anybody else, a physicist, I don't care what you do, you're going to have another branch that's probably going to be very developed, and the economics branch may not be as well developed, sort of depending on their background and expectations. That's how we think about our questions. And early on, when we get a question, that model is sort of very rapidly sort of coming to life in our head, and we're doing some preliminary research, and we're finding some of these staples that Rich was talking about. And all of that is sort of informing this model, and rearranging, bubbles on the screen, or however we want to organize this data, reorganizing our outline in our head of how to think about and how to attack this problem. Over time, you continue to refine that model in your head of what is it I know and what is it I need to know in order to be able to answer a particular question. And this is obviously more complex in team environments, right? I can talk about that, but if somebody's got a question about that, I don't think I have time to go into that, but there is obviously different in a team environment. But it continues, the model continues to evolve right up until the time when you're sort of done. And again, a fuzzy sort of done with whatever the question that you've been asked. It doesn't ever go away. And as new information comes in, or as you think harder about the problem, the model might shift, and sometimes in dramatic ways. But the amount of emphasis you're putting on it, in general, again, notional, over time declines. The second part of this is collection, and that's just collection of information. And you can kind of very easily see how I collect a new piece of information. I go to Wikipedia, I pull up an article on Burkina Faso because that's where my question is about. And I read about it and I realize, oh, some of the things that I thought were wrong, or it fills in a whole bunch of gaps for me that I didn't know about before. It generates a whole bunch of new questions. It expands my model. So you can see there's sort of a reflection back and forth against these processes. That's why they're sort of wide arrows, right? They reflect back and forth. Collection, as I collect new information, is going to impact my model. The new model, the model as it changes, is going to send me in new directions for new information. The third one is analysis, and again, analysis, particularly on intelligence questions, which are sort of about things typically that are not under your control. The data out there is messy and it's unclear, and it may be in different formats. We talked a little bit about that. Scott talked a little bit about that in his first presentation, about how the different the 3Vs and all that sort of stuff. That, as you start to collect certain kinds of data, that in turn sort of drives, well, I can use this analytic methodology, or I can use this analytic tool to be able to define that, right? So collection and analysis play off against each other. And as you start to do that preliminary analysis, it in turns can change the way your model, change the way you're thinking about the problem. So all of these are playing back and forth. And finally, you have this sort of production problem. And by production, I'm really talking about how do I produce the product to deliver it to the decision maker that I'm supporting. So in other words, different decision makers like to get information in different ways. How do I deliver that more effectively to one than the other? That's sort of a critical question. And the example I use to sort of highlight how this is the least emphasized thing at the beginning, but not no emphasis, right? I know it's very close to the 0 mark on here, but again, notional, right? It's notional. But is the most important thing at the end. You can easily see how production and putting the report together and getting the information, the PowerPoint slides or whatever we're trying to do, how that sort of becomes the focus of effort towards the end. But it's also really important at the beginning. And so something I used to ask my students is, when do you want to know that it's a 5-minute, you have to give a 5-minute brief, or they want a 20-page paper? Do you want to know that at the beginning of the project, or you want to know that at the end of the project? Well, of course you want to know at the beginning. So there is some emphasis on production, some emphasis on thought about how am I going to deliver this that's necessary at the beginning. But over time, it starts to elevate, and typically again, towards the end, you have this sort of need to create whatever it is you need to create in order to best not only answer the question, but communicate the question to the audience that's asked it, the senior decision maker, the CEO, or whoever it is that you're responding to. So that's sort of the model of again, my understanding of the intelligence process, but doing it in parallel. And let's talk about some of the consequences of that. So when you're looking at this, you have this sort of, I don't just need to be doing collection and then analysis. I need to have this sort of ability to go back and forth between those two things seamlessly. When you think about the software tools out there aren't a lot that do that, right? I mean, typically and then I want to move seamlessly into production, and I want to move back up into my modeling and change that. You could see that as almost 4 different pieces of software doing 4 different things, and I'm fact fingering from one to the, I may be building my model in my personal mind mapping tool, and then I've got to take the insights I get out of that, and I've got to turn that into keywords or into taskers for my primary source collectors or whatever I have to do. I don't have a seamless way of sort of taking the insights I'm getting on my modeling exercise and applying it to collection. When I'm collecting the information, is it automatically populating into my analytic tools and going where it's supposed to go, right? Oh, look, we just got this great big nice Excel spreadsheet full of data. Well, that should go over here somewhere to some sort of statistical package that I can do. No, I have to make those decisions, and all that's kind of all that slows you down. And then when I get an insight, I've got to fat finger it again into a 4th sort of form, Word or PowerPoint or whatever it is that I'm doing. So when you start to think about if my life is really operating in parallel, right? I'm doing everything at once. And I think a lot of Intel guys would tell you, hey, we do everything at once. And that's really what this shows. How do I rearrange my systems to better support that, right? How do I rearrange what I'm doing to better support this idea that it's not sequential, it's parallel. Interestingly enough, and I'll give you a couple pieces of data here, right? So Professor John Stasko, who's down at Georgia Tech, actually did a research study on this with one of his PhD students. He was writing software for the intelligence community, the national security intelligence community, and it really wasn't getting a lot of uptake. And they didn't understand it. The software guys didn't understand it. So they went and they did sort of they went out and started watching how Intel teams and analysts actually do their job. The number one finding of that study, which was published, I don't have the reference off the top of my head, but it was published. Number one finding of that is that intelligence is not a sequential activity. And we've been treating it like that because you Intel guys, keep showing us this Intel cycle. And so we create something that does collection really well. Or we do something that does a single kind of analysis really well. They don't talk to each other. And they certainly don't talk to each other in real time in parallel. And so their first finding was intelligence is not a sequential activity. And what we've been told is the way they do it isn't really the way they do it when you watch them. When you watch them do it, they don't do it the way they talk about it. So that's interesting. And then the second piece of data I'll share before I sort of open it up to comments or to the other panelists for comment is I've been doing this. I've been using this model to help me do dozens and dozens and dozens of Intel products for real clients. And when I got here to the War College, I had an opportunity to do it again. And in the past, it was always with traditional undergraduate and graduate students, and through the contracting mechanism I had at my old university, Mercyhurst. Now I'm at the War College. I had a whole different kind of students. Those of you familiar with the War College, we're talking about senior officers within the United States Army. This is their senior service school. This is before they go off to do great things at the Pentagon and where else. And oh, by the way, I should have said this at the beginning. Nothing I say here everything I say here is my personal comments. Nothing I say here represents the War College or the Department of Defense or the United States Army. It's all me. Anyway, so disclaimer out of the way. I had an opportunity to use this exact same system on very similar kinds of problems with them, and it worked. We were able to do things much more quickly. And that's really one of the big findings that I've had out of all the years that I've been using this, is that if you think about whatever your process is, you don't have to agree with this. Whatever your process is, if it's sequential now, try to reimagine it as a parallel process. And what are the implications for that in terms of how you would try to change things to make it work in parallel? I think there's real value added there. And the first value added, the one that I'm most comfortable with, absolutely most comfortable, is that it makes you fast. It makes you blindingly fast. We would traditionally take groups, teams, who knew almost nothing about a particular topic at the beginning, and within a fairly short period of time be able to produce very, very nuanced and interesting and decision maker. They all give it 2 thumbs up. They really liked the analysis that we were giving. And so I credit thinking in parallel rather than in sequence as a critical suggestion. Let me just say suggestion. I called it a suggestion at the beginning. I'll offer it as a suggestion again. For me, it's more than that because I've seen it work. But I think if you sit down and do the thought experiment of what would this look like as a parallel process, you may find some ways in which to speed up your own analysis and come to just as good a quality. Because I agree, intelligence is not something that you can just, it doesn't just emerge, right? You have to produce it, and there's a process that does that. I just think a sequential process in the 21st century is too slow. I think a parallel process is the way to go. This is mine. But I'm happy to hear comments from the other panelists and certainly willing to answer any questions that people might have. All right, thanks.
Thank you, Chris. And I'm going to assume that Rich and Scott will only echo that their concerns and their perspectives today are not those of Northrup Grumman and Ithaca College, respectively, right, guys?
True.
So that's kind of one of those unwritten mission statements in our community, right?
I got to say it. I don't have a choice.
No, I
It's a
understand.
requirement. My PAO said, "Thou shalt."
I understand. So I love that. Intel, not a sequential activity, the consequences of doing in parallel. And Beto asks a question that I think we sort of know the answer to. He states, I know it's quite generic, Chris, but you mentioned at the start of this process, how do you balance question-driven intelligence versus discovery-driven intel? And a comment on that, and Rich Caldwell, you're on deck after Chris addresses that question.
So in my experience, but everybody's experience is different. So really, and the answer to that question depends a lot on the decision maker, whoever it is that you're supporting, right? Intelligence is a support function. It's supporting CEOs, it's supporting generals, it's supporting somebody. And some of them are adamant about, thou shalt do what I tell you to do. And if that's the kind of boss you're working for, then that's the answer you got to get, right? Discovery driven it isn't going to be an option for you. But I've never, in my entire career, 35 years now of doing intel work, I've never had a decision maker who wasn't interested in discovery driven intel questions. So I don't think it matters for the most part. And the caveat to that is unless you've got a boss who frankly is an idiot, because they ought to want to know not just the answers to the questions they ask, but the questions they ought to be asking. And that's really kind of what you're getting at. So I hope that you're working. I mean, again, I've been fortunate, maybe it's just common. I think most people want to have access to that kind of information. And I've not really had a lot of problem pursuing that. We talk about that a lot in the intel field, but I've not ever experienced it myself. I've had some of them shut me down because I was going off too far in left field. But upon reflection, I realized that too, right? So it wasn't like it wasn't a bad call on their time. So that's sort of my take on it. Yeah.
Rich Caldwell, any reaction to Beto's question and also what Chris presents?
Yeah, so discovery, I call that stumbling upon good stuff, right? So we put together extensive, key intelligence topics, and actually I've adopted that model that you guys showed me at Reconverge of control factors. So you control things others control, things that nobody controls. And we'll put together an extensive list of kits to go after, and if you're doing your job right, you're going to discover things that just pop out at you. And that happens a lot at trade shows. I tell folks, hey, don't worry if you don't get your list done. If you do your job right, you're going to come across some pretty cool stuff. And a lot of times, and I tell them, hey, your plan is not going to survive first contact with the enemy. You may go in there and want to talk about the missile system, and they want to talk about the radar, right? Let them go. Let them tell you about the radar. And for the most part, I've come up with the best stuff on things that I didn't go out to collect on purpose. I would go back and I'd report, say, you asked for this. I didn't get a lot, but look what I found. And they're like, wow, we didn't know that. So discovery, that's a key thing. You're gonna do discovery. Yeah.
Any other comments on the graphic and the sequential versus parallel processes you'd like to share with the audience today, Rich?
Just on the parallel thing, we have been playing with some decision tools. I went out there, actually my team went out and looked at about 137 different online tools, polling tools, ranking tools, decision tools. And what we've been able to do now, instead of getting everybody in the room and say, let's look at this, we set it up, we put it out there and say, you've got until Friday to put your comments in here and things like that. And that's kind of a parallel approach. I don't have to wait for that day to do things. But I got to think about your ideas a little bit more. It's intriguing. I think I need to do some mind thoughts and mind experiments.
I think that's a common theme everybody's going to walk away from yesterday and today with is, boy, we may know a lot, but we have all that much more to learn. Scott Erickson, any reflection on what Chris has presented?
I thought it was great. It was really interesting, and I could see how it would really speed things up, where you don't have to wait for completion to start the next task. I'm curious as to whether, do you see efficiency loss? Because you're chugging along with something based on something else that you haven't finished yet. Do you have to then change it and backtrack sometimes and redo it based on what's happening in one of the other areas? Do you see a lot of that happening?
Oh yeah, that's you get tons of that. So it's and, what I tell students is Intel is not about writing, it's about rewriting, right? So you're constantly refining. And the Army has a concept they call the running estimate, right? Where you're constantly refining your estimate of the situation as you're moving through an operation. It's never sort of a fixed thing. Here's what we think based on the information we have now, but I've got predators out, and I've got all sorts of other activities happening that are going to give me information and are going to perhaps change sort of what I think about whatever intelligence analysis that I happen to be doing. So you're constantly updating, but we're doing that anyway, right? We're kind of doing that anyway. That's sort of par for the course, is for us to constantly be updating that. What I find is that, and it encourages you to be concise because you're going to have to do it again. Well, that's not a bad thing, right? That is definitely not a bad thing. And it encourages you not to, it gets your ego out of it, because if you've spent, you know how it is, when you spent X number of hours of doing something, right? You've invested yourself in that. But if you haven't invested a lot of yourself in it, you are more willing to let it go. And as new data comes in, you go, okay, new data. You become much more sort of clinical about it and much less emotional about it, because you've not invested in the long. Frankly, the more time you have between start and finish, so you're doing something that's strategic and you've got 6 months or thereabouts to do it, it's easy to get invested, right? So this process doesn't allow you to have that sort of ownership feeling without being able to back it up with data, because you're constantly revising it almost right up to the time that you present it. So I see, you're absolutely correct. You're constantly iterating on it, but I don't see that. I see that as a feature, not a bug.
Yeah, great. Yeah, one more quick thing, because I'm always thinking about training students, and I look at this. This looks incredibly complex. Where do you find people to do this successfully, and how do you train them?
So actually, it's not complex. It's really about you for me at least, it was about, I won't say for you, for me at least, it was about abandoning a lot of the tropes and a lot of the ways in which traditional education is done. You have to be prepared to sort of, the Canadians actually, part of this system came from what the Canadian educational system, or at least my understanding of Canadian educational system does in its K through 12, is that it has this sort of, the graphic you typically see is it's sort of a spiral up, right? Where every year they're getting a little bit more of what they got the year before. So it's this constant accretion effect, as opposed to we're going to teach this right now and then we're going to teach this. So it's almost parallel in its process. It actually is much less. There are some touch points within the system that I use. For example, I do actually have teams of students build individual mind maps of how they're thinking about the project, and then I have them cross-reference that with each other to sort of say, what are the differences, what are the similarities, how can we build a collective mind map of the project? So there are some touch points in there that help them sort of through the process. But in general, and this was the thing I was really excited about with last year, I took a whole different kind of student and a whole different kinds of questions and did exactly the same thing and got exactly the same kind of very positive results I've gotten in the past. And I did it in a very short period of time, right? And it's not because I'm that bright. It's not because I'm that good a teacher. It's because the process, thinking about this in parallel, speeds things up. Once you start to rethink how you teach, rethink how you do, with the idea that I've got to be touching all of these things all the time, but the emphasis has to change, you really wind up with a very different kind of class, and you wind up getting through, getting a lot more nuanced a lot more rigorous answers from your class or on projects or on, I mean, I use this for contract work and all sorts of other stuff. So, yeah.
Great.
Great. Boy, we could sit here and talk on this topic for a lot longer than 90 minutes. And I want to take an opportunity just to say thank you, Scott and Chris and Rich, for your contributions to an amazing topic today. I know I've learned a lot, and hope to see it continue in the Slack community of practice. Craig Fleischer, I see your question. It's an amazing one, and I'd encourage you to put that just in the interest of time that we're out of. If you wouldn't mind, please put that into the Slack channel, because I think everyone in our community here would be very interested in the discussion that ensues. It's been my privilege and honor to moderate you three esteemed Intel experts today. I thank you for that, and it's been great working with you. As we go through the next slide, kind of looking at what's next this afternoon, Suki Fuller said it well on the Slack channel an hour or two ago. Serious FOMO, fear of missing out with regards to the dual track that we're all encountering with this program. And I know I'm feeling that. At 1:30 Eastern today, you have a short break here coming up, break and virtual exhibit, but at 1:30 Eastern, you got to figure out your own FOMO with two amazing sessions. 4A, Elise Snockles is moderating, Phil Britton, Troy Pfeffer, and Victoria Richard on the concept of building nimble CI organizations and processes. Or you could choose to attend the amazing Ellen Naylor moderated session with Cynthia Chen Correa, Suki Fuller, and Michelle Sedekase on the topic of expanding perspectives and minimizing intelligence bias through diverse teams. Good luck making that decision. I will say if I ever want to reside on a farm, come visit a farm with a bunch of cats, dogs, and chickens, I'm going to you, Scott. Rich, if I ever need to fly a fighter jet, I'm going to come your way. And I know the answer, that I do not want to fence Chris Wheaton anytime in the near future, even though I'd love to learn a little bit about the art of fencing. So I hope we've left you all with some things to think about, some different processes, ways to create intelligence in an uncertain world, y'all. And look forward to continuing the discussion on the Slack channel and the community of practice in the days, weeks, and months to come. Thank you all for your amazing contributions today. See you soon.